I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, Dr. Steve Miller. Steve's the director at the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit based in Armidale. And I think he's very aptly qualified to be talking about using genetics to drive profit across livestock industries, as Steve's worked in genetics in Canada, the US, New Zealand, and now obviously in Australia. So welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for the invitation to speak. I guess when I looked at the topic and the remit, Hamish and Peter were saying, well, you got some experience in different countries, and relay that to the audience. I think as far as genetics driving profit, I think in terms of this audience, it's obvious that we can drive profit with genetics. But what I'm going to reflect on my experience in different countries is really the adoption of how, producers' adoption of the technology and getting it implemented. And in some ways it's kind of fun because I get to talk about something I know nothing about, and that's like social science and how people think and how they react to stimulus and things like that. I'm a quantitative geneticist. My background is crunching the numbers, but I guess over time, trying to get those things applied in practice is some learnings from around the world. So I was on faculty at a university in Canada called the University of Guelph for about 14 years before I went to New Zealand for 3, and then to America with American Angus for 4, and now here. And I'm going to touch on each of those countries and each of those experiences. But when I first started as a graduate student, I didn't realize, but I was kind of plunged into what's turned out to be for me as kind of a social science kind of an experiment, though they didn't know it was an experiment at the time. But at the time in Canada, we had back in the 80s, there was what they called record of performance programs. So producers would be recording traits on their animals, and it would all be being submitted to a central bureau, and then they'd get back information on productivity and things like this. So to kind of stimulate that, the province I lived in Ontario, they said, well, we're going to start something called the Red Meat Program. We're going to pay producers to record these things. And then once they get used to recording them and they've got the ability and they get used to the information, then they'll just do it by themselves. And what we see here in the graph here is a very interesting scenario. To put it in perspective, there's about 450,000 roughly mother cows at the time in Ontario for beef cattle. So when they were paying producers at the time, when they started $25 a weaning weight, about 1 in 4 producers stuck up their hands and said, yeah, I'll go out and tag all my calves and collect all the data. And that was, I guess you would say, successful. It wasn't just that they were paying them $25 a weaning weight. There was actually a whole infrastructure around it in terms of, extension people. There was programs for, help you buy scales. There was actually, weighmen or people that had portable scales that would go around to your farms to help you weigh your cattle and all that. The point is, as you can see on the graph, as soon as the money stopped, people basically stopped recording. And that's kind of about at the time where I entered the scene, because I graduated as an undergrad. I started in postgraduate work in quantitative genetics, and we started dealing with this data. So the government at the time said, well, we got all this data now, so they wanted a multi-breed genetic evaluation, because in Ontario at the time, there's actually a lot of crossbreeding taking place. So we actually had pretty good multi-breed data sets, and we could do a multi-breed genetic evaluation, and we accomplished that. But still, that didn't encourage people to basically stay in the program. So one of the take-home messages there is we have to be very careful in terms of if we're going to pay producers to do things, because we might get the result there, but once we stop paying, and there's actually some psychology work that's gone on in other studies I found, you're actually worse off than never paying them to begin with, because it's something called, it's kind of a negative economic incentive. Now, you were paying me. Now if I do it, it's not that I'm not getting paid. It's just I'm not actually getting paid what I used to get paid, and it's actually more negative than never paying them to begin with. So that was weaning weights, and this is what we had in terms of a bull test program. Same message. In the province, if you think about 450,000 cows, at the beginning of the program where they had almost 4,000 bulls every year being tested, that's basically all the seed stock bulls that are going out there. We're actually running through a central bull evaluation program. At that time in the 90s, I'd say that program was world leading. We had genetic evaluations for ultrasound traits when a lot of the breeds didn't have that. We had feed intake being measured in those central bull evaluation programs. We had evaluations for that. And we had it all put together in an economic index, which was also fairly new at the time. Something else was also happening in the time in Canada, and that is the government was kind of getting out of genetic improvement in some ways, in that they had these, they had a national program, and they had this provincial program. They said, well, we've got the red meat program's coming to an end. We've got all this data. Let's start a private company that can take this over and deliver it to the industry. And then eventually, you know, the industry will be paying, and the private company will take it on. The company at the time was called Bio, or Beef Improvement Ontario. Now it's called Ag Sites, and that's kind of a recent flyer for the company. You'll see it's more of a data company now in terms of linking data from consumer right back to the producers, and it's across species, not just beef cattle anymore. And they still do the genetic evaluations, but it's a much smaller part of their business. So what was also interesting at the time, because I worked closely with the company in the early days, they were basically seen as a threat by breed societies, and you can think about, well, why would that be? Well, here's a company now with a big multi-breed database, and producers could basically submit data and get back genetic evaluations and everything that they would normally get from a breed society, but they would take in records from, you know, if you had Charolais cattle, you didn't actually have to register them. You could just submit the data directly to Bio. That was seen as a big threat. It actually started something in Canada at the time where, you know, breed societies and this company, you know, they definitely did not get along. And on the genetics research side, you know, if you're working with that company, then the breed societies don't really want to work with you, and it kind of created this split. So there's two things there. It was a source of information. It was direct competition to breed societies, plus it was multi-breed, which at the time was pretty new, and that wasn't seen as a great idea by all of the societies either. So something else that I think something unique, and maybe here in Australia, considering that, you know, it is an island continent. When you're working in Canada, it's not, and you've got this, you know, there's lots of roads that go from north to south. So if you think in North America where all the cattle are, and you can kind of see Texas there at the bottom, but if you just take the width of Texas and you just go straight up, that's basically where a lot of cattle are in both Canada and the US. So in Canada, it's basically Saskatchewan and Alberta, and the breed societies are mostly located in Calgary. But if you're a Canadian seed stock breeder, you know, you want to have American buyers at your bull sale. So you want somebody to hook their pickup truck to a gooseneck trailer in Montana and drive up into Alberta to buy your bulls. And for them to buy with confidence, they actually have to have genetic evaluations that are the same across the border. The worst case scenario is, you know, somebody drives up, buys a bull at your sale, takes it home, registers it with the American Society, and the numbers all change. And so that doesn't give them a lot of confidence to buy bulls. So the Canadian breed societies wanted the numbers on their animals that are going to be the same as the U.S. So then that caused the Canadian societies to say, well, we're going to join in all our data with the U.S. And so then the national system in Canada, which was being run by the government at the time, wasn't really highly supported by the breeders. And again, all this privatization, they privatized not just beef cattle, but dairy cattle and pigs and sheep and everything else. And basically, the Canadian privatization is been highly successful. You know, all the AI companies got behind that, and it still runs today, and it's world leading. The beef example was called Canadian Beef Improvement. It was propped up with some money as a company to run genetic evaluations nationally for Canada. They hired geneticists. I was a little bit fortunate because I wasn't done my PhD yet, because someone came in and says, hey, this CBI is looking to hire geneticists. You should apply. And I said, well, I'm not actually done my PhD yet. Well, within 3 years, the company was bust because it wasn't basically supported by the breed societies. So I'll jump ahead a little bit. So we had this multi-breed evaluation going. We had indexes, and here's a company in the States, Lee Leachman with Leachman Cattle Company, looked at what we had and said, actually, that's what he needs. So we started doing the evaluations for Leachman. He was at the time the fourth largest seller of bulls, I guess you'd say, in America. And he took our index, the economic index that we'd been giving to producers in Canada since 1996, this is 2003, and it was customized for him, but he basically put the term on it, called it dollar profit. And the point I'd like to make here is how important it is to basically don't underestimate kind of having a champion in terms of bringing producers along and in terms of adoption, because we had Lee Leachman come back and talk to the Ontario producers a few years later, and at the end, and he's a great speaker, you know, he's very dynamic and everything, and one of the breeders from Ontario came up to me at the end, he goes, see, that dollar profit index, we need an index like that. I'm like, but you've had that since 1996. It wasn't called dollar profit. And we didn't have a Lee Leachman to come along and say, this is a great thing and you need to be doing it, right? So it really, I guess it drove home to me not to underestimate, you know, having a champion. Those lead breeders, you know, if they're against you, it's you're not going anywhere. You need the lead breeders to basically engage with the technology and they will pull a lot of people along with you. So genomics arrived on the scene in about 2005, and at the time, you know, what I've got here is, you know, we thought, can we make genomic selection work in livestock? 2009, they made it work in dairy cattle, and can we do the same in beef cattle? I think the rest is history now. We are doing it in beef cattle, and it has been a game changer. This is a professor of mine from Guelph, and he wrote a paper in 2006. So this is not implemented yet. Basically, it's just we have a chip, and we've got the theory of how we might do it. And he did some simulation work, and he said this is going to double the rate of genetic progress in dairy cattle in 2006. And here we sit in how many years that is later, 14 years later, and basically he was absolutely right. This is the genetic trend in Canadian dairy cattle. Before genomics, they were doing about 46 points a year in their index, and now they're doing about 102. So implementation of genomics has actually doubled the rate of progress. And I guess as a geneticist, you might have looked at the dairy cattle before and said, well, actually, you know, that is a genetic machine in terms of milk production. Can they actually go any faster? And so to think that actually going double that fast is pretty amazing. So genomics has played a big role in livestock around the world. So now, I guess just a few experiences from New Zealand. I wasn't there that long, but it was, I think, a few highlights, and some of these I think relate quite a bit to Australia as well. The first is now I'm dealing with beef and sheep farmers, and that doesn't, you know, what's the significance of that? For me, it was significant in a couple of ways, and the one thing I appreciate about sheep farmers, and I realize a lot of you are sheep farmers, is sheep farmers, for the most part in New Zealand, they sell carcasses, right? In North America, when you deal with beef farmers, they don't sell carcasses, they sell calves who go on to a backgrounder, maybe a feedlotter who eventually sells a carcass, and there's all those breaks in the supply chain. But you're dealing with a group of people now that actually understand supply chains and actually are more attuned to end product, and I thought that was interesting. There was a lot of similarities with Canada in that New Zealand really hadn't been doing much in beef research for about 20 years. Before we got there, so the industry wanted to get re-engaged with beef cattle, and so we started the project with a company formed called Beef and Lamb Genetics, and the first question that we were kind of faced with is they said, well, we want you to prove that EBVs work, and I kind of sat back and I said, well, this is 2013, and I thought we showed EBVs work back in the 1990s, you know, we're kind of taking a step back. But actually, the project, there's a couple elements. One, in terms of we measured maternal productivity traits, was something they're keenly interested in, and that became a joint project later with Australia, as well as starting this beef progeny test. But through the beef progeny test, we could clearly show here's how the bulls differ in terms of their EBVs. Here's the performance we saw in the calves. And there is that direct relationship between the two, that EBVs do actually work, and they work in New Zealand's production system. So in both, I'm going to move on here in a minute to something different in terms of Angus, specific examples with Angus. But maybe I'll just end up on something with Canada and New Zealand. In both countries, they've actually now got pretty active research programs. You know, there's thousands of carcasses measured through the beef progeny test now in New Zealand. And that data, you know, could make its way, it's not making its way at the moment into breed plan, but I think there's great potential there for these countries like New Zealand or for Canada, not just to be kind of a customer of a genetic evaluation, but actually to be a source of data. You know, they've actually got programs going on. You know, Canada I kind of described a rocky history, and I think in those early days of the 90s and kind of that, you know, the government starting multi-breed evaluations, the breed associations getting offside, has set them back, I think, for some time. But when I left in 2013, we had active programs with the Simmental Society, measuring feed efficiency and carcass quality and lots of data that's actually making its way into their evaluation today. They've started the program in Canada now called the Canadian Beef Improvement Network, and that is all the breed societies now are actually all together and actually driving the thing themselves. And I think it's they're going to start a data platform, and they've got great opportunities, I think, to get a lot of good data pulled together as a group. So, what I'm going to move on to now is I reached out to the Angus societies in Canada, New Zealand, the U.S., and Australia for some basic data around registrations and recording. And I thought it'd be interesting to compare, you know, the adoption of recording in different countries as to see if there's any relationship with some of the other things that I've experienced. So just to give you an idea of global registrations for Angus cattle, and just to make it simple, unfortunately 3 countries all have blue in their flags, so I was trying to think of some colors, so think of rugby, so think green for Australia, black for New Zealand, and then Canada, obviously the maple leaf is red, and blue in the flag for the U.S. So, and I've kept that color scheme the same throughout. So the blue line there is registrations for Angus cattle. And there's something I want you to see in that graph. There's basically that increase from the 90s up to today. So today they register in America about 300,000 cattle a year. But if we go back to 1990, it was less than 200,000. So it hasn't quite doubled since 1990, but almost. And if I think back to my days as a graduate student, the bull test program in Ontario, I'd go into a barn of 200 bulls. There'd be a whole pen of Simmental bulls, a whole pen of Charolais bulls, a whole pen of Limousin bulls. In that barn, there was 2 black Angus bulls. And now basically the province is going black like the rest of the industry. So there has been a huge increase in Angus, obviously, around the world, and you see the same trends there in the green and the red. The trend in New Zealand is actually pretty flat. I don't think they had the influx of European breeds to the same extent that we had in other parts of the world. So I really appreciate Keith's presentation, because I'm going to make this part short. But I think when I think about the pull for genetics, I think a company like Keith's and what he showed here today, that is the ultimate pull for genetic improvement, right? Where does all the money come from in terms of our whole seed stock business? It comes from somebody buying a piece of meat somewhere. Someone's going to buy a piece of meat. Keith gets paid. He pays commercial producers. Commercial producers go out and buy bulls, and that's what drives the whole thing. And we can't ignore that. And just, in 2016 I worked for the American Angus Association. It's in St. Joseph, Missouri, in the middle of the country, but they have this wholly owned subsidiary in Worcester, Ohio, called Certified Angus Beef. And I'd argue, now that I understand a lot more about it, what's driven that demand for Angus? It's branded products like this. That's because they're paying premiums back to producers. And there's a press release here just a few weeks ago, another record in terms of how many dollars they actually paid back in premiums. When I was there, they broke a record in terms of they sold 1 billion pounds of beef in a year, and that record keeps getting broken again and again. And last year they sold 1.2 billion pounds of certified Angus beef around the world. And that demand, I think, for high quality cattle is really drives behavior in terms of the producers and what they want to select for, and we'll see that in a minute. So I'm going to go through just trait recording country by country, and I'll go through some easy traits first, and then we'll get into some hard traits, because I think and for the easy traits, there's really not a lot of difference between the countries. There's obviously more birth weights being recorded in America just because there's more cattle, But when I look at, this is a ratio, if you look at the ratio there, it's roughly, all the countries now are about the same. They're somewhere between 80 and 100% of the calves actually get birth weights, which is great. If we look at yearling weight, about half the animals get yearling weights that get birth weights, which makes some sense for selection at weaning. And there's not too much difference between them, a little less there for Canada, and you'll see that trend come through here in some of the other slides. Now now we're getting into some I'd call them harder traits, but it's really not that hard to weigh a cow. I call them harder traits because in terms of our genetic evaluation, we limit when we want those cows weighed, and that creates a problem, at least in North America. Something else, if you look at those graphs, this is by birth year. So when you see the numbers look to be going down, they're not really going down. It's just those cows don't necessarily have a calf yet, and they've had a chance to be weighed. So it looks like it's dropping off, but maybe it's not that dramatic. But a couple things there is actually, although there's a lot less cattle in Australia, they're actually weighing more cows every year, which is interesting. But despite all that, if I do it as a percentage, even Australia, although they're doing much better than the rest of the countries, it's still less than 20% of the cows being weighed. And when I was at American Angus, I had a breeder call me up once, and he says, I'm thinking of putting in a grow safe. I'm just wondering if it's a good investment, and should I, because it's a lot of money, but I think I'm ready to put in a grow safe. And I said, well, that's, we've got evaluation for feed intake, and it goes into the index, and, so there's a pathway there for you if you want to do that. But then I said, so do you weigh all your cows? Do you measure heifer pregnancy on all your heifers? Do you measure docility on all your females? Do you do feet and leg score on everybody? Well, no. That's low-hanging fruit compared to putting in a grow safe, right? And I think cow weight is one of the lowest hanging fruits out there in terms of efficiency, right? The idea that we can have, cows of more moderate size still producing those big carcasses and fast growth rates. We want to identify those outliers, and we won't identify them if people don't weigh their cows. So I've kind of got a thing, and Matt Wolcott's going to talk later, but I don't think we can push on hard enough about the importance of measuring mature cow weight. Carcass weights. The interesting thing about this graph is there's only two colored lines on there. There's no data coming from New Zealand or Canada into either breed plan or the North American evaluation. So all the Canadian data comes into the American evaluation, basically. So it's basically one evaluation. And I know there's data there because I was involved with research projects that collected it. So we've got to work at getting, and there's data in New Zealand as well, and getting those data sources in is, I think, important. This, I think, is maybe one of the biggest success stories in livestock breeding, and I guess when we see the results there at Rangers Valley, like how do we get that increase in marbling? Well, we need accurate breeding values. And this is the adoption of IMF scanning that happened. And so back in the 90s, when it first became available, the blue line there, basically pretty much every breeder, every yearling weight, every animal with a yearling weight would have been scanned in those early days. And the question, why is that? Well, to get the index value, you had to have the breeding value. To get the breeding value, you had to scan your animals. And I think, the fact that we actually had a tool that was highly correlated with the carcass records available on young animals in North America anyways, in the feedlot system, was a boon. There is a concern. If you look at that line, you see it's going down. And breeders, the talk in North America will be, well, we used to bring in 140,000 scans a year. Now we're bringing in 80, or maybe we're going down to 70. Is that a problem? And when I crunch the numbers, I can show that if I was to genotype an animal at birth, I've got a breeding value now as accurate as if I scanned the animal. And if you genotyped your animal, then you scanned it, the accuracy doesn't go up by hardly anything. So the incentive for the breeder is not that high, actually, to scan their animals, and that is a problem. But I'm not convinced that getting rid of scanning is actually a great idea. So it is a bit of a conundrum at the moment. The data source, I think there's over that time where commercial buyers are used to buying bulls that have got scan records, they like to see the data. They don't like to see that information is no longer available. So I think For the moment, I guess the good news is we're still getting 60 to 80,000 records a year, which is a lot of data, and most of those animals are genotyped. If we look at a ratio, it's actually interesting because almost all animals here in Australia and New Zealand are actually scanned for IMF, and that's, I think, a good news story. And the scanning in Canada, although we had, there was lots of research and programs going on at the time, has not been adopted very well. And I was involved with programs there where they, again, tried to pay breeders to scan their cattle or do it for free or things, but they still couldn't get them to do it. So, genotyping. This has been, now this, again, this graph is by birth year, so you look at that drop there, but that's actually not, there's more cattle, there's more genotypes rolling in every year, year on year. That's not actually a dip, it's just to do with the birth year in terms of calves born in 2021, they could still send in a sample this year, for example, and get a genotype. But if I add up all the genotypes across all the different Angus societies, there's close to 1.5 million animals genotyped now. Over 1.2 in America, over 200,000 here in Australia. So, and those numbers as a proportionate, if I go to the next slide, keep going up. So we're getting close to 60% in America. We're pushing almost every animal genotyped here in Australia. It's a little bit different because the numbers, the green line, talking to Andrew, also includes some heifer select animals, so there's a few thousand animals in there that are not necessarily registered, but still, the trend, I think the message is, genotyping is becoming the norm. And I actually had breeders would call me up in America and say, well, why is he genotyping? It's because, in a way, we've kind of forced him to, because we've made it this expectation that animals are genotyped. Well, it is, those animals, their breeding values are definitely more accurate, and they're making more progress. So it is, it has really taken off. I guess if I go back to this slide, and I look at that blue line, it's amazing to think, going back to paying people to do things and trying to incentivize and get things started, nobody paid any breeders to actually, all those genotypes, the 1.2 million in the US, bar, the odd research project here or there, almost all of that money has been paid out of breeders' pockets. And I think that's a healthy ecosystem. This isn't my saying, but I learned it because it was kind of passed down through the generations when I was at Angus. Nothing incentivizes recording more than what you see there. And that's not a graphic where something's missing, but the point is, it's an empty box. So when we if we come up with a new breeding value or an index, and we put it out there for breeders, and your animals don't have that number, that suddenly that incentivizes recording, because I don't want to look like I don't have information for my buyers, and that's become. I think on the Canadian side of things, they didn't have an economic index for a lot of years until recently. So they didn't have a blank box there to drive the incentive for people to scan their cattle and get all the information. Something else I think I'm observing in the U.S. I think has played a big role, and I go back to that, the Lee Leachman being a leader and dragging people with him. This conference here, this BIF conference, is where those leaders go. And they're there with the scientists, the eggheads from AgBoo and the people from, the university and things like that. I would call the makers of the technology, and they're the shakers. So we got to bring the makers and shakers together, and they do that every year. And I think that's been a big driver in terms of adoption, because they don't get together at that conference and talk about, do EBVs work? There's no question about that. They might think, well, can we make them work better, or is this one as accurate as it could be, or can we make it better this way or that way? But I think it sets the tone that we're going to implement the science, and I think that's really important. So forums exactly like this are really important. The other thing I think is important is what they call here, boots on the ground. So at Angus in America, they had 13 regional managers that basically drive up driveways, go to bull sales, and for me, they were a great extension arm, because they would say, well, they were talking to this breeder, there's concerns about this, and then you could get ahead of the conversation a little bit, and that was really valuable. So just to give you a perspective there, I think that's over 1 million kilometers. So those regional managers collectively would have driven 1 million kilometers last year visiting different people, which is not to be underestimated, I don't think. One of the key messages I want to make is this push versus pull. I think it's got to be a pull, you know. And here's just two examples, and I'll get to it in a minute. But the one push is, a push would be a bull breeder says, you know, these bulls have better EPDs and indexes, the progeny are more valuable, so you should pay more for these bulls. The pull is, the commercial guy says, progeny of these genetically superior sires are bringing more money at the auctions, and the feeders are willing to pay a premium. I need to find such bulls, and they're worth the money. You know, those are two different things, and I think the push model really doesn't work. So what we did when I was at Angus, and this might have been kind of 20 years in the making because we kind of laid the groundwork for it 20 years earlier when I was at Guelph, but it was to pull together what we call the feeder calf program. And the feeder calf program is basically to put a genetic value on a group of feeder calves, because primarily the situation in North America is we got a commercial producer, he's got calves, the calves go to auction and then they get sold. But at market, at auction, what's the information? Well, they're 600 pounds, they're all vaccinated, they're black. There's really not a lot of information that goes with those cattle. The idea was take the genetic information in terms of what sires they're from, what sires the cow herd's from, and boil that down into an economic value. And we made a score. And the graphs there, the bar graphs, basically show now that they've done hundreds of thousands of cattle, they can relate the scores we gave them when they bought them to how they actually fed out. And there you see a direct relationship between our grid score, which is heavily to do with marbling, and how many animals actually made high marbling grades. So what happens then is the feeders say, for example, if I was Keith, you know, I say, well, these cattle I'm buying with higher grid scores are actually more of them, less of them are those 2s and unders, and more of those are the 4 pluses. I got to buy, I'll pay more for those cattle. The commercial guy then says, those cattle that score better, I'm getting more money for those cattle. I got to get better scores. He goes back to his bull supplier and says, you know, I need bulls that are going to give me these scores. The bull supplier says, well, I got to up my game in terms of recording carcass traits and genomics and everything else to get better EBVs. And I think that's the pull. So just wrapping up with what I think are the common truths that I would think I've seen. Genetic improvement's like a rope. You need to pull it. You can't push it. There's power in the data, and the breeders out there are collecting the data, and that's not to be underestimated. There's millions, there's over 2 million ultrasound records now in American Angus's database. You know, we can't have a system where we can't disengage those. We can't disengage that. I think that's got to be, we've got to think about getting all the data together to make the best tools for everybody. And extension adoption is, again, I'm not a social scientist, but I don't think it's ever done, and we've got to keep working on it. And finally, just to thank the groups that helped me with the data. So the Angus societies in all the different countries, ABRI for pulling data together for me for Angus New Zealand, and Ag Sites for the historical data. Thanks.